Afternoon, everybody. I'm Charles Shapiro, President of World Affairs Council. It's a pleasure to have you here. Everybody here today are members of the World Affairs Council, so this is great. We've done it, keep it small on purpose so that you'll get a chance to get your questions answered. Our guest today is Dennis Lockhart, who I think all of us know. Dennis is a former president and CEO of the Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank. He's now a professor of practice, is that right?
That's right.
At the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech. Dennis worked at Citibank for 17 years and 13 years at Heller Financial, 2 years as the managing partner of a boutique investment firm. Then he went into academia, taught 4 years at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. And at the same time, I don't know how, managed to be an adjunct professor at the Johns Hopkins School for Advanced and International Studies, his alma mater, where Dennis got his master's degree. He was president of the Atlanta Fed from 2010 to 2017, a founding board member of the World Affairs Council, and our very first board chair. So thank you for being here, Dennis. Our program today is brought to you by the UPS Foundation, which I appreciate. And everybody, to ask questions, if you go down if you're new to Zoom, move your cursor down to the bottom of the screen and you'll see the chat function, and click on chat. And then you can send the questions to Fernanda Lucchini. Fernanda's going to combine similar questions, edit out if any of you are irate and angry at Dennis for having done the wrong thing when he was at the Fed. And Fernanda will send the questions to me in all caps so that I can read them. So this is great. So Dennis, let's start out. The news this morning is the unemployment rate. It was announced at 14.7%, the highest since not the recession, but the Great Depression of the 1930s. What's your assessment of the current state of our economy?
Obviously pretty bad. It's stunning how we went from 3.5% unemployment to officially 14.7% in a matter of a few weeks, literally. And I think the 14.7% probably understates the current reality. The way the unemployment rate is actually calculated is that there's a reference week that includes the 12th of the month, and it's a household survey with telephone calls to a good enough sample to therefore calculate an unemployment rate. And so that survey took place earlier in April, so all of the layoffs that have occurred since the survey are not included in the calculation. There's also the technicality that the way the survey works is they ask people in a household whether you have looked for work in the last 4 weeks. My guess is that a lot of people who have been laid off would say it's hopeless. Why would I bother to look for work in these circumstances? And then you've had the glitches with the state unemployment insurance applications and so forth. So my guess is it's a worse situation than 14.7, and probably will get worse before it gets better. So that's the employment side. Employment is affecting demand. Demand is, of course, the driver of the economy, consumer demand particularly. And I think the weakening of the economy continues to cascade, so that the year-over-year quarterly decline in output likely to be in the 20 to 25% range. Quite literally, we have never seen anything like this. The Atlanta Fed has a nowcast of GDP called GDP Now, and they showed 17.6%, I think, this morning based on the data to date this quarter. But I think as the quarter progresses and probably gets a little bit worse, even with the reopening a little bit worse in many respects. I think we're going to see a very startling contraction of the economy in the second quarter. So that's where we are today. I
That's
think,
pretty rosy.
yeah,
Yeah.
I'm sorry to be the bearer of such pessimistic news, but that's where we are today. And then the question, of course, is where do we go from here?
Okay, so that is the question. Where do we go from here? What kind of recovery do you think we're going to have? Is it going to be a neat V-shaped recovery, and by January 1, the unemployment rate will be back at 3.8%, and economy will be perking along again?
I think the starting point of any attempt to forecast the economy throughout the rest of the year and into next year is really the public health situation, which I think is riddled with uncertainties at the moment. And so if you can tell me how the epidemic will actually evolve and how effective some of our public health measures are likely to be, then I can take some kind of an educated guess at how the economy will actually evolve. So my way of thinking about this is that I think we have to anticipate a range of possible scenarios for the economy. I'll give you the optimistic end of that range, in my opinion, and that is that the fourth quarter looks a lot better than the second quarter. The second quarter turns out to be by far the worst quarter, that we have been reasonably successful in flattening the curve. Maybe a vaccine arrives earlier than the more sober assessments of that, so could conceivably arrive in the fall, and the distribution of that vaccine is widespread enough that we get a much better immunity picture. In that case, I would think that the shape of the recovery would be not a V, not back to where we were pre-pandemic, but more like a check mark, if you will, where the right side of the check is shorter and then it flattens out for a fairly long period of time, which could go for years. But we will recover some percentage of the pre-pandemic economy, and then we'll be in a long slog to try to rebuild what has been lost during this process. That's my depiction of the optimistic case. I think the pessimistic case is that the public health situation is on and off again in terms of economic suppression because of the behavior of the epidemic or the virus, that the public health response goes slowly, that it takes a long time to get a vaccine. Not only do we have to get a vaccine tested and viewed as effective, but we also have to get it manufactured and distributed, and that simply takes a great deal of time. And in the meantime, outbreaks here and there cause more of a shark's tooth kind of picture to how the economy is shut down and then turned on and shut down and turned off, turned on again in various geographies around the country. And that just turns out to be a protracted crisis that takes a long time to get into a public health situation where you're comfortable, and for that reason, a very long, deep recession is a nice way of putting it. I think that's the pessimistic end of the spectrum. And somewhere in between is probably what will actually come out, but I don't think it's very wise to be making predictions that are highly specific in these circumstances.
How's the response in the economic response by the government been? I mean, Congress has passed 3 different measures to keep the economy going, to cushion the collapse, to help give people money that they can spend. The Fed has got this extraordinary, $500 billion, which I think is supposed to be transferred into, trillions of dollars in lending authority to make loans, to buy corporate debt. What's your assessment of the policy actions taken thus far?
Well, I think the magnitude of response is totally called for. So one of the things I learned in the 2008 financial crisis in the Fed is that it's probably much wiser to pull out all of your ammunition, all your cannons, and try to blast a crisis up front, as opposed to just taking an incremental approach week by week or month by month, and run the risk of undershooting what's needed to change the psychology of the matter, as well as just the fundamental economic picture. So I think both the Fed and the administration with Congress have done that. They have pulled out all stops, whatever it takes, has really been, in a way, the mantra. And I think that was the right policy given the severity of the shock that the economy was hit with. Now, I can quibble with how some of the programs have been rolled out.
Sure.
And I would say, in sympathy with the policymakers, having been one myself once, you never expect these things to be perfect. You are trying to design them in too short a period of time to anticipate everything that could possibly go wrong. And then you're trying to implement through agencies that may not really be equipped to implement something of that scale. I think the SBA has been criticized that it was a relatively small agency, and
Right.
all of a sudden it has to put out all this money to small businesses across the country. I think some of that could have been anticipated, and maybe another day or two of 24-hour days of design work would have maybe fended off some of the problems we've seen. But at the end of the day, I have to be somewhat sympathetic that you just can't roll these things out rapidly and have them go perfectly. The Fed per se has implemented, I think, 9 different programs. Just a word on what the Fed has been trying to do. They have been fighting a 3-front war. They've been trying to deal with the domestic economy, with market functioning in the financial system, and at the same time have been trying to do some helpful things regarding global financial stability. So all 3 of those areas of risk, if you will, have been addressed by programs, and the domestic market programs, I think there are 9 different programs that have been put into place, and they have done things that we did not do in 2008. So they've really attacked the problems with a broader scope of activity than in the financial crisis of 2008. I think the markets have been largely stabilized. There are some weaknesses that have to be addressed, like the municipal market, state and local governments. They started only with investment grade, and are probably going to have to go below investment grade in some respects to stabilize those markets. But overall, that's worked pretty well. Whether or not the relief package that was passed by Congress is going to be enough, it depends on the duration of the crisis and the duration of the evolution of the epidemic. And so it's hard to predict whether we're going to see a situation where there's going to be call for more to be done.
How has Chairman Powell done? I mean, he's been under huge pressure from every side you can imagine. How's he done?
Well, I worked with Jay Powell for 5 years. I'm very fond of him as a person and very supportive of him as chair of the Federal Reserve. So it probably won't surprise you that I think he's done quite well under the circumstances. He accelerated by 3 days, but 3 days meant something. The dropping of the policy interest rate to zero. It's actually 0 to 25 basis points, but that was done very quickly in March. He didn't really get cold feet about that. He moved the interest rate in 2 moves, 150 basis points, 1.5% very quickly. And then the Fed has rolled out these financial market stabilization, mostly debt market stabilization programs. I think some of those have taken time. Some of them have been slow, and there was damage done while they were trying to perfect the technicalities of the program. But on balance, you have to give them credit for that. And then finally, I think Powell's communication, understandably, has been very careful, and he's not cavalier in how he says things. But on balance, I think it's been pretty effective. I watch all of his press conferences after FOMC meetings, and I admire how he's been able to handle the different questions and stick to a script that is a well thought out rhetorical response to what is obviously a very nervous populace and very nervous set of financial markets.
Just quickly, I'm going to have you explain the acronym so everybody knows. What's the FOMC?
FOMC is the Federal Open Market Committee. It's the committee on which Raphael Bostic, my successor, sits. And it's the committee that decides monetary policy in the United States.
Yeah, it's what most of us think about when we think about the Fed, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's not the only thing the Fed does, but it certainly has the highest public profile.
And it is a committee, so it's a committee decision, and therefore Powell has to be a leader and bring along maybe recalcitrant members to a policy decision, and all those decisions effectively have to be made in a day and a half, and it works. So I think other parts of government could learn something by watching it.
You mentioned global financial security.
Stability, yeah.
Stability, pardon me.
Yeah.
I actually wrote down stability and read it as security. Commodity prices are at rock bottom right now. Developing world is in huge economic crisis. Tell me about the global financial stability risk picture. I mean, what's going to happen? Are we going to see collapses around the world in Africa, Latin America, and Asia?
Well, obviously a financial crisis along the lines of 2008, which reflected global contagion of distrust among financial institutions, and therefore the whole credit system, not only in the United States, but all over the world, seized up, and that created a recession. Obviously, that would be a compounding effect if it were to develop. So far, we have not seen any terribly serious outcomes that would signal the beginning of a financial crisis. But I think you have to watch the situation very carefully. And as you pointed out, it is the emerging market. The term emerging markets captures a wide variety of countries, and some of them are are in better shape than others. But if you were to generalize, the emerging markets are facing serious problems with particularly their external debt and their ability based on commodity income to service that external debt. In some cases, the governments are, as we are in the United States, seeing a tremendous drop-off in revenues. So domestically, local currency denominated debt also under pressure. So there's a lot of anticipation that some kind of bailout of a number of countries may have to take place. The IMF is dealing with this and floating ideas of debt relief in some form, or a new wave of SDR issuance, special drawing rights issuance, as a way of dealing with it. It's a troublesome picture. It's a sort of a background story as we here in the United States experience our own economic crisis, but it is there. The banks in the developed world are not as in good shape as in the United States. In the United States, the banking system went into this crisis in pretty decent shape, well capitalized, decent liquidity, and so far the banks have held up pretty well. Now, in the United States, you have to worry about a run on non-banks or non-bank financial institutions, money market funds, and other entities that are not strictly speaking banks and are therefore less regulated, sometimes unregulated, and that could be a fault line in our own financial system. The stabilization efforts in the financial markets by the Fed helps to alleviate that risk. So that what I would say to answer your question in general terms is, so far so good. There are clearly areas of weakness, but we have not seen the onset of a financial crisis that would just make the overall situation here and elsewhere worse.
Okay, let me remind everybody, please send your questions to Fernanda. We're getting close to the part where we're going to ask your questions to Dennis, so please send them in. Dennis, your crystal ball is working so well. What's the economy going to look like? Whether it's 6 months from now, a year from now, 18 months from now, what's the post-pandemic economy going to look like? What can you tell us? What sectors are going to be strong? Which are going to be weak? How is our economy going to change? How's the global economy going to change? Small question.
Yeah. Well, again, I think you have to think in terms of a range of possible outcomes. But I think there are some predictable, conventional wisdom predictions that deserve to be said. For example, the digitization of the economy is likely to accelerate. We've operated in a virtual situation, as we're doing with this meeting, and so many companies are operating virtually with people working remotely and so forth, that I think that will only accelerate, because it, in some respects, has worked pretty well. Companies are going to want to invest in that digitization. I think remote work is likely to be much more acceptable and much more standard, and that means that office space and so forth will be configured differently, and the demand for office space may decline or may at least change. Certain sectors of the economy, either because of damage during this crisis or because of behavior patterns that follow the crisis, are likely to be affected for the long term. The airline industry, for example, and everything associated with business and tourist travel is likely to, in my opinion, see a very long period of recovery. And I think there's a reasonable chance that we'll see some structural change in how the economy is actually configured, with sectors like the airline sector simply smaller and or arguably weaker than before, and the hospitality sector affected that way conceivably, and other sectors, telecom, everything that supports a more digitized and virtual way of operating in the economy for at least some businesses and some amount of employees. Those areas may be stronger and more important. The one that I think is hard to predict is healthcare. Healthcare is 17 or 18% of GDP prior to the pandemic. I think it's going through, quite literally a solvency crisis in the case of many providers of healthcare. Whether some of those hospitals get wiped out and don't come back, and whether some aspects of the provider system simply don't recover quickly remains to be seen. I anticipate we will have a very, very active debate about our healthcare system and our public health system, the amount of money that needs to be spent on the public health system post-pandemic. And therefore, there could be structural change in that very important sector of the economy. So I would answer your question by some combination of temporary and probably fleeting change of behavior with some structural and therefore long-term changes in the economy.
Okay, I mean, I've got loads of questions, but now they're starting to come in. So let me ask the questions from the audience. Do you see a chance that there will be negative interest rates in the United States, something that I don't think has ever happened historically?
There was a time a few weeks ago when the 3-month Treasury rate traded negative. But the real question is, will the policymakers drive the policy rate to negative territory? This is nominal, by the way, the nominal interest rate, not the one that would be adjusted for inflation. We've seen many cases, or at least substantial occasions, of the real interest rate going negative, which it did in the 2008 and 2009. That's when you basically take the nominal rate and adjust it for the prevailing inflation rate. But the real question is whether the Fed, the FOMC, will actually do what's been done in Japan and what's been done in Europe, and that is take the policy rate into negative territory. Mm-hmm. The mantra for many, many years, and it continues to be the answer to this question when posed to Jay Powell, is no, we will not do that. It's very, very, very unlikely that it would occur in the United States. And that's partly for technical reasons, because the structure of our financial system is such that implementation of a yield curve that starts in negative territory and therefore requires that, if you will, depositors or creditors, depositors or providers of capital be paid. I'm getting this wrong, excuse me. It requires that depositors pay for having their money in a financial institution, right, or in a money market fund or whatever. That's hard to implement in our system. But I would say that the odds of that are not 100% negative, and that the chances of that as a last resort, and it very, very much would be a last resort, are greater than they would have been 6 months ago or 2 years ago. So I would not totally rule out that it's the FOMC, the Fed decides that as a last resort, they have to do that.
talk a second about inflation. I mean, what I learned in my economics class freshman year is we should be having huge inflation right now. Between the Fed and Congress, I mean, we've essentially, I mean, it's the virtual equivalent of the Fed going down the basement and printing like $3 trillion and injecting it into the economy. Our inflation rate has not gone up. Do you expect to see a huge jump in inflation in 6 months or a year?
Never say never. I'm on the side that believes it's unlikely. Let me put some numbers on the money printing, if you will, the monetary base growth that you alluded to. Before the pandemic hit, the balance sheet of the central bank, the Federal Reserve, was a little over $4 trillion. It is estimated, predicted by some, that the balance sheet will be $9 to $12 trillion when this is all over. Therefore, more than doubling of the balance sheet, and the liability side of the balance sheet of the central bank is the monetary base. And then from the monetary base, the banking system uses reserves they have to underpin lending, and that money gets out into the broad economy. We all of us of a certain age had the same Econ 101 lesson that you listened to, and that is Milton Friedman's statement that inflation is always a monetary phenomenon. It's too much money chasing too few goods. Now, the world according to Lockhart, that principle, which is sacrosanct among certain circles among economists, it has been brought into some doubt by the experience of the last decade or more. And it may be that economists simply don't understand inflation in today's world. Or to put it in economist terms, they don't have a good model for inflation. The monetary model may not just be correct in today's world. I will speculate that there are drags on the price level in the economy related to demographics, related to the effect of technology on the market basket and the prices of goods that are deflationary in their effect. And therefore, the net inflation rate is simply weaker than the money supply numbers would suggest. I think that is a reasonable way to look at it. So on your question, inflation, that would be undesired hyperinflation versus a continuing battle with disinflation, maybe even deflation under these circumstances. I'm on the latter side, not the former side.
So I don't need to rush out and buy gold or buy Bitcoin.
That you can make that decision yourself, but I'm not doing that.
Okay. Here's a question from Eric Joyner. Asks, what's the impact of the conflict between the United States and China? What will be the impact on US-China trade?
Well, it's a very, very big question. And I think, again, this is, according to me, this is just my own view. I don't think it's necessarily in our interest to be raising tensions with China, perhaps scapegoating China about the beginnings of this pandemic, given the fact that we may very well need China and may need them in a very important way, and that is the manufacturing of vaccines when that comes about. That's a short-term question, and whether the Chinese would respond to the broader raising of tensions with some rationing of vaccine that would hurt the United States while we're going through this period, I don't know. But there's no question that tensions have been raised, and the backdrop of those higher tensions is a foreign policy picture that now is painting China as a big power rival that really didn't respond in many ways to overtures from the United States in the last decade to become more of a partner. And therefore, we've sort of shifted into a view that China is more of an enemy and more of a bad guy in the world than we had hoped it would happen as China emerged from being a poor country to a middle-income country and raised its profile in the world. The supply you asked the question earlier about what the post-pandemic economy would look like. I suspect there will be a substantial look at supply chains that originate in China or run through China to pursue on the part of various industries and various companies a less dependence on China, and for that matter, a more resilient supply chain. But we are going into a period for which for near-term reasons and longer-term reasons, tensions with China are greater, and that's probably not good for either side.
I was just thinking, as you were talking about collapsing economies and emerging markets, that results in immigration. I mean, do you foresee huge immigration from Africa and Middle East to Europe and from Latin America to the U.S.?
Well, I think there will be pressures in that respect, whether the United States can control it or Europe can control it in the case of Africa remains to be seen. But the root cause is exacerbated by the pandemic.
Right.
The root cause has been poverty, lack of opportunity for a population that skews young, or in the case of the Middle East, Syria, a conflict. Now you add to that the pandemic as a root cause and the economic effect of the pandemic, perhaps exacerbated if it goes on for quite some time by climate effects.
Mm-hmm.
You have a perfect storm, if you will, of root causes of immigration pressure. And that's going to be an enormous challenge, obviously.
We're clearly having too damn many perfect storms. It's quite a mess. Talk about, we had a program 2 days ago with Stavros Lambrinidis, the European Union ambassador to the United States. And as part of our conversation, he just, in almost an offhand remark, said that one of the advantages that European businesses have is national health plans. That it's not something that private companies have to worry about, that companies aren't paying insurance for employees, and that it was an advantage. You talked earlier about we need to have a discussion. Do you see us moving as a result of this, where we all realize that, the poorest paid workers who don't have health plans can infect us with this pandemic? The people who are delivering things to our houses, the Uber driver, the landscapers, the cashiers in the supermarkets. Is this going to change because of the pandemic? Is it going to change our perception of healthcare?
I think it's going to renew a debate that will take a little more seriously than what we call kind of the middle ground on the U.S. health system took it. The question of a phasing in of a national health system of some kind. My own take on that is you don't do it overnight. You may take 2 decades to do it. That, of course, raises the question of whether the political support could be sustained for that period of time. But the proposals of the progressive left, which even a number of Democratic candidates dismissed as impractical, I think will now be looked at again in this election season, conceivably, but post-election and post-pandemic, because the readiness of our healthcare system, the resilience or the robustness of our public health system simply hasn't stood up to the challenge we faced in the last few weeks. And that is reflected in the numbers of at least measured infected people and deaths on a global basis. US appears to be faring worse than lots of other places that have a different system. I still think the practicalities of this, and particularly telling 150 million people who get healthcare through their employer that they're going to have to make a change is a non-starter. I continue to believe that, but you know, with 30 million people who have lost jobs, that base is smaller, and we're going to have a national discussion. Now, to the point that the ambassador made, if you're running a business in the EU, you don't have to pay for your portion of health insurance. It's not part of your cost base in most of the countries. And that means your cost base is a little bit more resilient to a major shock that you're incurring now than a full-blown US employer that provides health insurance, maybe very ample health insurance to its employee base, and then all of a sudden faces no revenues. So you can imagine what happens in our system because of that.
Wow. I see a very healthy, not healthy, a long and acrimonious debate over this. You know, people are going to, because certainly Italy, Spain, and France, which have, I mean, France has the vaunted national health system of the world, and they haven't done particularly well either. So,
yep,
it's going to be interesting. Just in closing, this week, I mean, today, Neiman Marcus filed for bankruptcy. Earlier this week, J. Crew filed for bankruptcy. You talked earlier about people buying stuff online instead of going to the store. What's just real quickly, and because this is an advertisement because Jag Sheth is also going to talk about this next week. What do you see as the future of retail? You talk about structural change in our economy. How's that structural change going to hit retail?
Well, of course, it depends on how long this situation lasts. The duration of the epidemic, fundamentally, that's underpinning the economic effects. The need for economic suppression is the term I use, which is a basket of measures that are imposed on various jurisdictions. And if it lasts long and we have a resurgence of the epidemic and takes a while to get to a vaccine, and this is a story that simply goes into next year and even conceivably longer, a lot of retail is going to be wiped out because the behavior of consumers, regardless of whether these stores are open or not, is likely to be more frugal and more inclined not to go to the shopping center to get whatever you need. And so I don't think it's crazy to fear for a lot of retail, particularly if this epidemic goes on for several more months. Some of them were hurting in the first place prior to the pandemic, and therefore this has just been a double whammy to many in the retail sector. Those that have a robust online business can probably survive with a mixed model of their business, but some people don't want to buy everything online. Many people still want to try on a dress or a suit before buying it, and we'll find that maybe they don't need the suit or don't need the dress as much as they thought. So it's to be a combination, I think, of consumer behavior and the question of whether or not certain amount of capacity in retail has just been wiped out.
Dennis, this has been great. I really appreciate your devoting this time, answering the questions. I'm sitting here taking notes. I've learned a lot. I know that Miss Snow, my high school economics teacher at Northside High School, is spinning in her grave right now.
Yeah.
What she taught us about inflation is no longer correct.
May not be. You never say never. We could still see an inflationary spike, but I think there is reason to doubt that now based on experience.
Yeah, Dennis, this has been terrific 45 minutes. I want to thank you. I want to thank everybody in our audience. I want to do a little advertisement. I want you please, next week on Tuesday, May 12th, we've got former Senator Tom Daschle in conversation with Clyde Tuggle, and they're going to be talking about the future of healthcare in the United States. So it flows directly from what we've been discussing today. On Wednesday next week, we have Dr. Jagdish Sheth, one of our board members and teacher at the Goizueta Business School at Emory, talking about exactly this, the future of retailing. And then on Thursday, May 14th, we have Brad Allison, who is the CEO of HAC International. It's a global supplier of meat, poultry, fish, and vegetables. And they're the guys when, why is there not this or not that in my supermarket? They're the people who can answer that question. And it is HAC International is the company that Eric Joyner founded. They're based in Sandy Springs. So that's going to be terrific. I ask you all, please register and join us next week. On May 28th, we have Stacey Abrams. She's going to speak about challenges facing global democracies amid COVID-19. We're working with Governor Brian Kemp's staff to schedule a date for him. And that brings me to the advertising part. It's time to make a donation to the World Affairs Council, guys. Tuesday was Giving Tuesday. This is, Helpful Friday maybe, but we need some help. We can't do in-person programs. We can't put on conferences. So we would greatly appreciate it. If you'd like to sponsor one of our Zoom programs, please contact me. And I got to tell you, Sunday is Mother's Day. And if you haven't bought a gift yet for your mom, I think what you ought to do is sponsor one of our Zoom programs, and we will talk about your mom on the program. So
there you go.
There you go.
A great product.
This is a great product, and your mother's going to appreciate it. Thank you again, Dennis. Thank you to UPS Foundation for sponsoring this program today. And thank all of you for joining us. And I hope to see you next Tuesday with Tom Daschle and Clyde Tuggle.
Great.
Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.